the house on Mourner's Hill. The small town of Gray's Hollow had always been a place where time moved slowly, like the winding river that cut through its heart. Nothing much changed here, and people rarely left. For years, the town had been haunted by stories of an eerie mansion that stood atop Mourner's Hill. Its white facade gleamed against the darkening sky, despite being abandoned for over 2 decades. No one had lived in the house for as long as anyone could remember, but it stood there, untouched, like a pristine relic from a time long forgotten. It had been built on land that once held a graveyard, though no one could remember who was buried there. The soil was said to be cursed, soaked in the secrets of the past. The mansion, however, didn't show any sign of age. Its windows were clear, the front door shining with a fresh coat of paint, and the furniture inside appeared new. But despite its outward appearance, the house had become a forbidden place. People crossed the street to avoid walking by it, too scared to even talk about it. The construction of the house had started some 20 years ago, and right from the beginning things had gone wrong. The workers who were hired to build it quickly found themselves experiencing strange and terrifying occurrences. The first signs were subtle: tools disappearing without a trace, strange cold spots that would suddenly form in the air, and the unnerving feeling that they were being watched. One of the first incidents happened on the 3rd day of work. A construction worker named Greg, while hammering nails into the frame of the house, suddenly dropped his tools. When he looked up, he swore he saw a figure standing at the far end of the property, its silhouette tall and shadowy against the dimming light. Greg called out, but the figure didn't move. When he turned his head for just a moment to grab his tools, the figure was gone. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the eerie feeling lingered. The workers laughed it off as a trick of the mind, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. Within a week, a foreman named Charles went missing. He'd been last seen in the lower floors of the house, but when the rest of the crew searched for him, they found nothing but his hard hat, lying on the floor of the basement. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, just the feeling that he had simply vanished. When Charles's body was eventually found weeks later, it was discovered miles from the town, twisted and contorted in ways that defied logic. His eyes were wide open, his mouth frozen in a scream. No one could explain how he ended up so far from the site, or what had caused his body to contort so violently. As more workers began to leave, the few who stayed started to hear strange noises at night. Creaks and groans of the house settling were replaced by whispers, low and unintelligible, as if voices were emanating from the walls themselves. Tools began to appear in strange places, as though they had been moved by invisible hands. The crew was spooked, and morale plummeted. But despite the mounting terror, the house was completed, and as the last nail was hammered into place, the house stood there, pristine and perfect, with no hint of the suffering it had caused. Months passed, and no one dared to approach the house. But then, a young family moved to Gray's Hollow: Ben, Sarah, and their 2 children, Lily and Max. They were a picture of normalcy, an ordinary family looking for a fresh start. Sarah was drawn to the house almost immediately. It was big, beautiful, and offered plenty of space for the family to grow. But Ben, sensing something strange about the house, was hesitant. "Something feels off about this place," Ben said one evening, his voice low as he stood at the window, looking out at the mansion. "I don't know what it is, but I don't like it." Sarah smiled, dismissing his concerns. "It's just an old house, Ben. It's perfect for us." At first, everything seemed fine. They moved in, unpacked, and began making the house feel like home. But from the very first night, strange things began happening. The children were the first to notice. Lily, their 5-year-old daughter, would cry out at night, insisting that she saw a woman standing at the foot of her bed. Max, her older brother, refused to sleep in his room, claiming that something was watching him from the closet. Ben tried to reassure them, but deep down, he felt a growing sense of dread. One evening, while Sarah was preparing dinner in the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the window. The woman was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her face obscured by dark, tangled hair. The figure didn't move. Sarah's heart raced, and she quickly turned away, convincing herself it was just a trick of the light. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, grew eerily quiet at night. The walls seemed to creak under the weight of something unseen, and the air became cold and damp. Ben started to wake up in the middle of the night, feeling as if something was standing over him. His body would be frozen in place, his mind racing with the thought that someone or something was in the room with him. He would wake Sarah, but when they searched the house, there was never any sign of an intruder. Lily's nightmares worsened, and she began to speak of the lady in the dark, a figure who visited her at night. She described the woman in chilling detail, her pale face, hollow eyes, and the tattered dress she wore. Max, too, became more withdrawn, locking himself in his room and refusing to come out at night. It wasn't long before the tension in the house reached a breaking point. The family was falling apart. Ben was losing sleep, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sarah, too, began to grow ill. Headaches, dizziness, and a sense of unease that wouldn't leave her. One night, a loud crash echoed through the house, and they discovered the kitchen in disarray. Cabinets open, dishes smashed on the floor, but no sign of anyone having broken in. The house felt more oppressive than ever before. It felt as though it was alive, breathing, watching them. In the dead of night, they fled. Weeks passed, and the house remained empty. The town grew quieter as rumors swirled about the curse that seemed to have plagued the house from the beginning. No one dared go near it, not even to look at it. The once beautiful mansion had become a symbol of fear. The locals whispered that the land was never meant to hold a house, that something far darker than the living had been disturbed in the process of construction. Time wore on. No one came forward to claim the house. It stood in silence, its pristine appearance slowly fading under the weight of its own dark history. Until one day, a new family arrived. Daniel, Laura, and their teenage son Sam had been searching for a new start, drawn to Gray's Hollow by the promise of a quiet life. The house, though its history was well known, seemed to call to them. They had no fear of the rumors surrounding the place. In fact, they were excited to make the mansion their own. The first few weeks were blissfully quiet, but it didn't take long for the unsettling events to begin. Sam, who had always been a brave, adventurous boy, began to act strange. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, claiming that he had seen someone standing in his room. He described a figure, a woman, like the ones before him, but more intense, more real. Laura tried to reassure him, but the feeling in the house began to change. The whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder, clearer. One evening, Daniel found a strange object in the attic, an old, ornate mirror with intricate carvings. The glass was covered in a thin layer of dust, but when Daniel cleaned it off, he saw something that made his blood run cold. His reflection was not his own. In the mirror, he saw a shadow standing behind him, a tall, faceless figure. He turned around, but the room was empty. That night, the house seemed to press in on them. The walls felt like they were closing, the air thick and suffocating. They heard footsteps in the hallway, but when they went to investigate, there was no one there. The house had a pulse, a heartbeat that seemed to sync with their own, and the whispers grew louder. A week later, the family packed their things and left, never to return. After the family left, the house remained vacant once more. The town had long since written it off, but some strange part of them still watched, waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter. And then, one fateful day, a couple unnamed, unfamiliar arrived at the mansion. The house, once again, seemed perfect, untouched by time. They moved in eagerly, unaware of the chilling history they were stepping into. The house, however, had not finished its work. It had never stopped waiting. End of chapter 11. As night fell, the house sighed, and the whispers began once more. The Forgotten Village. Olivia Thompson was a journalist, known for chasing stories others wouldn't touch. When she first heard whispers about a mysterious village that had vanished off the map, she couldn't resist. It was the perfect opportunity for a headline-grabbing piece. She had grown tired of the usual beat, the dull press releases. A story about a village lost to time? It was too intriguing to ignore. The village, they said, was called Eldridge, and it had disappeared without a trace. No one knew exactly what had happened, but the few that spoke of it said something had happened, something terrible. The town was supposedly located in the middle of nowhere, deep within a forgotten stretch of forest, its roads abandoned and overgrown. Locals in the nearby town spoke of strange happenings, of people vanishing, of eerie lights in the night sky, and the chilling fact that no one who ventured there ever returned. Olivia's editor was skeptical, but the potential of the story outweighed the risks. She packed her camera, notebook, and a couple of supplies, ready for what she thought would be a simple investigation. After several hours of winding roads and dense woods, Olivia's GPS suddenly went blank. She checked her map, but there were no roads marked, just dense forest. As the sky darkened, she felt her unease grow, but the thought of getting a groundbreaking story pushed her forward. Eventually, she stumbled upon a rusted sign half hidden by vines. It was old, its letters almost unreadable, but she could make out one word: Eldridge. The village looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, though the buildings were remarkably intact. The houses stood in eerie silence, their windows dark, their doors slightly ajar. No animals roamed the streets, no signs of life anywhere. Olivia stepped out of her car, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The village seemed frozen in time. The streets were eerily clean, as if someone had been maintaining it, but there was no one here. The silence was unnerving. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. It was as if the village itself was holding its breath. She walked down the narrow streets, taking pictures of the houses and the decaying storefronts. Everything appeared to be as it was when the village had been abandoned. Furniture left behind, dust collecting on old books and dishes, and yet nothing seemed to have aged. The air was unnaturally still, as if time itself had come to a halt. At the edge of the village, she found what appeared to be the remnants of a public square. At the center stood a crumbling fountain, its water long gone. A large statue loomed nearby, its features worn down by time but still recognizable. An angel, its wings broken and chipped. Beneath the statue was a plaque, barely legible due to age, but Olivia could make out a few words. Apua, enatonmes, alitra ora. A chill ran down her spine, but she dismissed it as the wind picking up in the trees. As she continued to explore, the silence began to weigh on her, making every footstep feel like an intrusion into the village's forgotten history. She sighed. That night, Olivia stayed in a small, abandoned inn on the outskirts of the village. The place was cold, but it was better than sleeping in the car. As she sat at the desk, reviewing her notes, a soft creak echoed from the hallway outside her room. She paused, straining to listen, but the house was still, the silence unbroken. It was probably the house settling, she thought, but the noise made her uneasy. She pushed it aside and continued typing on her laptop. Suddenly, the power went out. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. The room plunged into darkness, the faint hum of electricity vanishing. Her breath caught in her throat as the temperature dropped. She grabbed her flashlight and flicked it on, the beam casting long shadows against the walls. The light flickered as she stood up, making her way to the door. Another creak echoed from the hallway, louder this time, as though someone, or something, was walking. She opened the door cautiously, peering into the dim corridor. No one was there. The air felt cold and damp, more so than when she first entered. Something felt wrong. But she couldn't put her finger on it. As she turned to close the door, her eyes caught something on the floor. Footprints, fresh, wet. They led down the hallway, and to her shock, they were heading toward the stairs. As she looked, they were heading toward the stairs. They had come from the attic. She followed them, her pulse pounding in her ears, but by the time she reached the stairs, the footprints had vanished, fading as though they had never existed. Her heart raced, and a chill of fear settled deep in her bones. Something was in this village with her, something that hadn't left. The next morning, Olivia's anxiety was mounting. She couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the village itself was somehow alive, watching her every move. Her camera wasn't capturing anything unusual, but her instincts told her that there was more to Eldridge than met the eye. She decided to visit the village's old library, hoping to uncover some historical details about what had caused the villagers to leave so suddenly. The library was small and neglected, but still contained rows of old books. As she sifted through dusty pages, she found a journal, its leather cover worn and faded. It was the diary of a man named George Eldridge, one of the last inhabitants of the village. The entries started innocuously enough, describing his daily life in the village, but as she read on, the tone shifted. The final few pages were frantic, written in a scrawling hand that seemed to grow more and more erratic. The darkness is coming. They've come back. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake to disturb them. They told us not to dig, not to open the ground, but we didn't listen. Now they are waking, and they are angry. The final entry was a single line, repeated over and over again. We should have left. We should have left. Eldridge had been abandoned, but not because of the usual reasons of economic decline or natural disaster. No, the villagers had left because they had disturbed something beneath the earth, something that had been waiting, something ancient and powerful that now haunted every inch of the village. The hairs on the back of Olivia's neck stood on end as she closed the journal. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this something was, it was still here, still waiting for the next person to uncover its secret. As Olivia left the library, the ground trembled beneath her feet. A low rumble echoed through the village, faint at first, but growing louder. The trees swayed, their branches groaning as if they too were trying to warn her. Suddenly, the ground split open in front of her. The earth cracked, and from the depths of the earth a terrible, guttural sound echoed. A shadow, dark and twisted, rose from the crack. A figure that was both human and something else. Something ancient. Olivia froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The shadow reached out toward her, its form shifting and changing, as if it were not bound by the rules of the physical world. She stumbled back, her heart pounding as the shadow crept closer. Her heart stopped its ticking mechanism. Alarm bells had been tinkling. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered from the darkness. It was the same voice that had called to her in the village, the same voice that had echoed through her mind ever since she set foot in Eldridge. In that moment, Olivia understood. The village wasn't abandoned because of the villagers' fear. They had left because they had uncovered something that should have remained hidden forever. Something dark, something ancient, had been waiting for centuries. And now, it had found a new victim. Olivia staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest as the dark figure loomed in front of her. It was both human and something else, its shape twisted and indistinct, like smoke made flesh. The air around it seemed to warp, rippling with unnatural energy. The ground beneath Olivia's feet cracked further, a dark void opening up as the figure reached out toward her, its arms stretching unnaturally long. Her breath hitched as she stumbled backward, the whispering voices in her mind growing louder, urging her to run, to flee the village before it was too late. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, more distinct, as though it were inside her head, speaking directly to her thoughts. "You disturbed us. Now you belong to Eldritch, as they all do." Olivia's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but the village seemed to be closing in on her. The once empty streets were now filled with shadowy figures, pale faces with hollow eyes, watching her, moving silently, like the village itself had come alive. She turned to run, but as she moved, the ground beneath her feet buckled. She stumbled and fell, the earth shaking as though it was alive. The sky overhead darkened, and the oppressive weight of the air pressed down on her chest. The sound of distant whispers filled the air, as if the entire village was speaking, murmuring a language she couldn't understand. Olivia scrambled to her feet, fear pushing her forward. She had to get out, she had to warn someone. But no matter which way she ran, the village kept pulling her back. Every street, every alley led to the same place, the center of Eldritch, where the dark figure stood waiting. She could hear the growls of the shadows, the whispers of the spirits trapped in the village, all of them converging on her. There was no escape. As Olivia was drawn toward the center of the village, she felt an overwhelming pressure, as if the village itself were pulling her into its dark heart. The sound of distant cries echoed in the air, the voices of those who had come before her, trapped by the same dark force that now sought to claim her. In the center of the village stood the remains of an old church, its spire broken, its walls crumbling. Yet despite its dilapidated state, the church exuded a strange, oppressive power. The ground in front of it was scorched, blackened, as though something had burned through the earth itself. The figure was waiting for her at the church's entrance, its face now fully visible. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its skin was a pale, ashen gray, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its eyes were black voids, filled with darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. "You've come to uncover the truth," the figure hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers mixed together. "But the truth is not for the living. The village of Eldritch belongs to the darkness, and so shall you." Olivia stood frozen, her breath shallow. She felt as though she were suffocating, as if the weight of the village itself were pressing down on her. She realized now that Eldritch was not just a village. It was a prison, a trap designed to keep something ancient and malevolent locked away. The villagers had come here seeking something, knowledge, power, or perhaps they were just desperate. And they had awakened what should have stayed buried. The voice of George Eldridge echoed in her mind. "We should have left. We should have left." Michael's dark eyes followed her path, their contents secret. Olivia's pulse raced. "What is it? What is it that you're hiding? What is this place?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fear. The figure tilted its head as though amused by her question. It spoke, its words slow and deliberate. "This place is a bridge, a threshold. The village of Eldritch sits on the boundary between worlds. The villagers dug too deep, and in doing so, they opened the gate. We have been waiting for you, and now we are free." Suddenly, the ground trembled violently beneath her feet, and the earth split open. A low, rumbling growl rose from the depths, shaking the very foundations of the village. From the crack in the earth, dark tendrils of shadow rose, coiling and twisting like serpents, their forms shifting in unnatural ways. The shadows reached for Olivia, but she couldn't move. The fear paralyzed her, her mind overwhelmed by the realization that she had wandered too far into something she couldn't understand. Then, just as the shadows were about to engulf her, a blinding light pierced through the darkness. The air hummed with energy, and Olivia gasped as a figure appeared in front of her. It was a man, his features obscured by the light, but there was something familiar about him. "You must leave," the figure said, his voice commanding but kind. "The village has no place for the living. You cannot fight this alone." Olivia tried to speak, to ask who he was, but the words caught in her throat. The shadows swirled around her, and the figure seemed to grow weaker with each passing moment. "Run," the figure whispered urgently, before he was consumed by the darkness. Without thinking, Olivia turned and fled, her legs burning as she ran through the twisting streets. The village seemed to close in on her, its streets narrowing, the shadows chasing her, the whispers growing louder. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs began to ache with exhaustion. The voices of the villagers rose around her, calling out, begging her to stop. But she couldn't. She couldn't let the village claim her, too. She ran and ran, not knowing where she was going, but only that she had to escape. Wait, she thought, wait. As Olivia reached the edge of the village, she could see the outline of the forest ahead of her. The path through the trees was dark, but it was her only chance. She pushed herself forward, her breath ragged in her chest, her heart hammering in her ears. Behind her, the darkness seemed to slow, as though the village was pulling back, waiting. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the growls, they were still there, lurking just out of reach, but she was free. She broke through the trees into the forest and didn't stop running until she could no longer hear the sounds of the village behind her. The next morning, Olivia found herself back in the town near Eldridge. The road was silent, the sky clear, the air fresh. It was as though nothing had happened, as though Eldridge didn't exist at all. But deep down, Olivia knew the truth. The village had not just vanished, it had become a prison, a place where something ancient and malevolent lay waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to wander in. And though Olivia had escaped, she couldn't shake the feeling that Eldridge had claimed a part of her. A part that would always be tethered to the village, to the darkness that now roamed free. As she looked back toward the forest, she felt a shiver run down her spine. Eldridge was gone, but its memory, its curse, would never leave her.